Okay, the test is over. I think the class average was about 75 or 76, something like that, with the extra credit. So there'll be some of this evolutionary stuff on the final, not a lot, but a little bit. But now it's time for a new section. So, anybody answer the question? You know when you see it, maybe? How's that? What's light? Anybody? How do you define it? Nothing?
Start reading.
What?
Morning. Start reading.
No, that's okay. Say it again.
And when you start reading.
Okay. Well, certainly there's cellular respiration.
Yeah.
In other words, you've got to take in certain things for reactions to actually happen. Okay? Okay, anybody else? I know someone knows what life is. What do you think life is? Think about all of life. Not just us, the bacteria, all that kind of stuff.
Well, life reproduces.
Good? Okay. Excellent. Anything else? I have someone back here. So we did this side of the room, so it's got to be this side. What do you think life is? Okay. Well, anything else? Okay. Okay. We haven't defined it yet, so we're getting there. What's life made of? Huh? Okay. We're a carbon-based life form. Anything else? What do you think is the fundamental unit of life? Hmm?
Sex, reproduction.
Well, we got that. What reproduces?
Organism.
Okay, at a much smaller level. Huh?
Eggs, sperm,
Genes.
Well, those are gametes, yeah. Cells, okay.
matter.
Cells, yeah?
All living organisms have cells.
Right, exactly. Okay. Now, what are some properties of life that are, let's say, different than, let's say, matter like rocks or things like that?
Bacteria. Would that be considered
What's that?
bacteria?
Well, bacteria are definitely cells, and they're definitely alive. But what makes a cell different than a rock? What makes life different than a rock?
Has the ability to like reproduce.
Okay, you got that? What else? Could you actually have anything going on, any kind of metabolism going on without cells? I mean, without... Someone said, what, chemical reactions, right? Well, cells have some properties that require certain conditions, physical conditions, to operate. Obviously, there's temperature and things like that. But generally, you think of cells as they're an enclosed space, right? And what's inside is different than what's outside. And for all these chemical reactions to actually take place, cells provide a space where it's under control. So, properties of life again. This is an important concept. Homeostasis. Basically, it's a closed system that is actively regulated to remain very nearly constant. Now, it's not just cells that do this. In fact, the whole organism does it too, in terms of like the right temperature, right? Having temperature somewhat within a certain range, having certain reactions take place. So homeostasis is really important. Like also pH, blood pH, that means whether it's acidic or alkaline. It's a property. And then there's all these ions that are used. Now ions are, we all know what elements are, like carbon, calcium, potassium, sodium. Well, what ions are is, in this case, they're cations. It means that the electrons have been stripped off of them. In other words, they have a charge, a positive charge. There are also ions that are negative charge. Those are anions. And they have a negative charge. And the importance of ions is that you can use them to create what's called a chemical gradient. It's kind of like Anybody know what diffusion is? Diffusion? Okay. Okay, just think of this liquid containing this red. And then outside, there's nothing. There's just something that's white, okay, inside. Well, there's a gradient, and if it can pass through a membrane, which is, in this case, a cell membrane, it will diffuse into the surrounding area. And in this case, it will diffuse so that some of this leaks out, and let's say all the other stuff leaks in, and eventually, what you'll have is, so here's the original thing. What you'll eventually have is this is pink, okay? And there'll be equal amounts in both sides. That's what's called diffusion. Well, chemical gradients in cells are created the same way. You have these cations, these ions that are charged, and they're created so that they go down a gradient towards a place that has a negative charge, and eventually it all kind of evens out. So these kinds of gradients are very important for all sorts of cellular activity, but just think about like how neurons work. It's all about chemical gradients. Everything is. Okay. So, fundamental unit of life is a cell. Now, before there were microscopes, no one knew about cells. So, did anybody hear what some hypotheses were about what life was or what cell? They did know about cells, about what life is. Huh? Anything?
What was your question?
So, back before anybody knew about cells, what was considered, how did they define life? Okay. The Greeks had these four humors: water, fire, I forget what it was, bile, and something else. And then they considered there to be some sort of spark of life. But they didn't really know. In fact, that's why before cells were actually discovered, people used to do all sorts of things to get better, to be cured of a disease or to prevent disease. And one of them was like bleeding. They used to bleed people, thinking that it actually helped them balance the humors. Okay? They had no understanding. Of course, when you bleed someone, well, a lot of bad things could happen, and especially the person's sick. So that was a common standard practice because they didn't know. Well, when microscopes came along and they were able to see these single-cell organisms, they were shocked. Just like with a telescope, they could see planets and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and things like that they couldn't see before. So this is where technology comes in terms of new hypotheses. And then someone looked at, let's say, a plant underneath a microscope, and they saw these things that we call cells, and look at animal tissue, the same sort of thing. So suddenly, there was, they had a hypothesis. Life isn't about the four humors. It's actually, the hypothesis is that life is made of cells, entirely made of cells. Anything without cells is not life. Well, that's not entirely true, of course. There's viruses. Viruses are not cells. Viruses are parasites that take over the cellular machinery to make copies of themselves. Now, there's some dispute about whether viruses are actually living or not, because a lot of viruses will remain viable for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and only activate when they come in contact with, the right conditions. So I've always thought that viruses are life, because so they don't have a cell, but they use a cell to make copies of themselves, and they evolve like anything else. Anyway, we have some cells here. Looks like rod-shaped bacteria. I'm not sure. Oh, a blood cell, red blood cell. I'm not sure what these are. Okay. So, all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. However, this whole thing about viruses that I just mentioned. Now, we talked about reproduction. Not only do whole organisms reproduce using cells, like gametes, whether it's sperm or eggs, but all cells come from pre-existing cells. Now, this is the whole, it's like evolution, when we talked about evolution. Common ancestry, right? Well, it looks like we are the descendants of a common ancestor, which was a single-celled organism. Probably at one point much like a bacteria, but even more fundamental than that. So this was a theory, by the way. It's still a cell theory, and there's a lot that goes into it in terms of how cells work, certain properties of cells at the molecular level. Now, so here are, I'll show you where we are. We are right there. Hold on. Get this. Okay. Okay. That's Animalia. Now, it shows, in fact, that we're also related to fungi. This thing about showing plants as being closely related to us, they're not. We're a lot less closely related to plants than we are to fungi, as it turns out. But this whole domain are called the eukarya. And we'll define what that is in a second. There's also, as you're probably well aware, there's bacteria, right? But back in the 70s, people were finding other organisms that were single cell, that didn't have a nucleus, and they weren't sure what it was. And it turns out it was another domain called archaea. mainly because it looked like it was full of a bunch of what are called extremophiles, organisms that can survive in, let's say, very hot places, very cold places, highly acidic places, things like that. So he proposed another domain of life. Now at that point, there was the whole classification of kingdom, phylum, that you learned a little bit about. Well, there was the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and then all these single-celled organisms. They had bacteria, then they had single-celled organisms with nucleus, and they were called Monera. No, in fact, all those single-celled, everything, including bacteria. There was a grab bag of all sorts of stuff, and it turns out they didn't really understand how closely related things were back then, or what the relationship was. Anyway, it turns out, in terms of eukaryotes, we're more closely related. If you look at this phylogram, we share a common ancestor there. We are more closely related to archaea than we are, both of us, to bacteria. However, most eukaryotes actually have bacterial elements in them, and those are called organelles, like mitochondria. It's the factory of cells. Chloroplasts for plants that produce carbon, carbohydrates, and things like that. So anyway, now there might even be some new domain that we just haven't become aware of at this point. I mean, 1970 was, 40-something years ago. Seems like a long time, but it isn't. It's pretty recent. And it was very controversial. I mean, people had this idea of classification and what life was and all that. So it's changed. In fact, there's these giant viruses that they've discovered that are as big as bacteria, and they seem to have their own metabolic activity, which would make them not exactly viruses, but they also use other cells to carry out some of those. So things are still changing. Okay. So normally, viruses are very small. In fact, you can't even generally see them with a microscope. You need a scanning electron microscope to actually see them. And then, these are bacteria. Now, they're called prokaryotic cells because prokaryotes was a classification of cells that did not have nucleuses, whereas cells that had nucleuses were part of our eukaryotes, like all of us. And then there was the archaea they didn't know about. So archaea also has very small cells about this size, let's say. This is a cyanobacterium, which is one of the organelles it was a bacteria incorporated into the cells of eukaryotes. And it's photosynthetic. And so this cyanobacteria, and then here we have Staphylococcus, more bacteria. And then right here, we have what's called a eukaryotic cell. Okay. Now, I've crossed out the prokaryotic because phylogenetically, remember those phylogeny diagrams? You want to group things that are alike from descent, common, from a descent from a common ancestor. And bacteria and archaea are considered prokaryotes, but prokaryotes also, if you look at life, there's that third domain that's not included. Okay, so we're just going to call them bacteria and archaea, and then eukaryotic cells. So all cells are surrounded by what's called a plasma membrane. Okay. That's where everything, all the stuff that happens, all the chemical reactions happen inside a cell, and the barrier that holds it all together is some sort of plasma membrane. And it's made of what's called a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so let's break this down. Phos is probably phosphorus. Now a lipid is actually a fat. Okay, that's what a lipid is, a fat. And fats have properties that are different from, let's say, things like cells that are full of water. Okay, so what it does is, as we'll see here. Okay, so here's the membrane protein, right? And there's actually these are all different proteins so that things can come in. These are proteins on the outside. And here is where the lipids are. And lipids are hydrophobic. That means they keep water out. Hydrophilic means that water can come in. Now, bacteria and archaea, as I mentioned, what were considered prokaryotes, they do not have subcellular compartments such as a nucleus. Okay, they just have all the DNA right inside the cell. So this is a common. Now that I want to go back. So the phospholipid bilayer is really important. It's how cells keep things out from the outside, compared to what's going on in the inside. And it's because of this property of what fats are. So if you pour in fat into water, the fat all conglomerates on the top. It doesn't mix with water. Okay, now, so here's a eukaryotic cell, right? This is a bacteria. It's got a cell wall. It's got DNA inside. It's also got flagella so that it can move around. Not all bacteria do have that. So eukaryotes have cells with a nucleus and other organisms. That means, if I actually look at it, okay. Here's the nucleus. These are ribosomes where DNA is eventually turned into RNA and then into proteins. This is a mitochondria. Let me, okay. And they are the power plants of cells. We're going to learn about them. And then there's all this other stuff here that once there's a protein, proteins are often modified. So once they're translated into a protein, which we'll learn about, then they get modified to do certain jobs in certain cells. Now, so this is basically a eukaryotic cell. It turns out that the mitochondria, they have their own DNA. And the closest living relatives of mitochondria are actually bacteria. So it looks like at one point in the evolution of eukarya, perhaps a cell, an archaea cell, engulfed a bacteria, and then instead of digesting it, actually they started developing what's called a mutualistic relationship. So this is the basic idea of what a eukaryotic cell is. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, DNA is transcribed into what's called RNA, which is then translated into amino acids and protein. Okay, now that means that the DNA itself doesn't do anything. Doesn't do any chemical reactions or anything like that. The chemical reactions of putting a protein together all happen with RNA. And proteins are what our body is made of, and then we also use other things that we create, like things like cholesterol, which is another lipid. And they're used for all sorts of things, like there are proteins that are signaling proteins, where they have, let's say, some molecules sticking out that that are touching other cells, or that they release a certain chemical like a hormone, like insulin, let's say. That's a protein too. You have transport proteins. That means they carry things. One of the most common is actually cholesterol as a transport protein. It's a transport of fats, a lipid, carrying a protein to certain areas. Cytoskeletal proteins, these are proteins that kind of keep a cell in the right shape. Immune proteins, like antibodies, are a good example. Receptor proteins receive signals and alter cell function, like receiving stuff like a hormone, good example. And then there's enzymes, and what enzymes do is they catalyze reactions, chemical reactions, that allow metabolic processes that all cells do. If you didn't have catalysts in there, the reactions would take so much energy that you'd never be able to actually do them. So usually enzymes make it possible for all these chemical reactions to actually happen. You don't have to memorize all these different things. I would remember enzyme. You'll learn about antibodies much later. But that's what we are. We have cells that do all these things, that have signaling proteins. Some of them are transport proteins, whatever. And proteins, we say they get things done. They're the basic structure that makes life possible. Now, enzymes are a class of protein, as I mentioned. They catalyze chemical reactions. Like alcohol dehydrogenase. Anything with ASE is an enzyme. Anytime you see something with an ASE, it means it's an enzyme. it carries out chemical reaction. In this case, alcohol dehydrogenase is the thing that breaks down alcohol that we drink. So it's a very important protein, enzyme, that breaks down alcohol. If it didn't, then alcohol would build up, and of course, you can still get alcohol toxicity, but it manages to break it down. It all happens in the liver. Lactase, CASE, is the enzyme that breaks down milk from a complex carbohydrate into a simple carbohydrate. There's another one, DNA polymerase. That means it's used to make copies of your DNA. Okay? And it does it by attaching certain molecules together. So, anybody in here lactose intolerant? Okay. Now, most mammals, as adults, are lactose intolerant. Just think about it this way. Where do you get milk from? You get milk from the mother, right? And there's a certain point with mammals where, of course, the mother stops producing milk for the offspring and they have to eat other things. But in the beginning, they're making milk. And as I mentioned, milk is composed of two molecules. They're composed of what's called glucose, which is a very basic carbohydrate, and then something called galactose. And they have to be broken down, and that reaction happens on what's called lactase, which is an enzyme. And it has these active sites that these things actually fit into, right? And the same thing happens with sucrose, same thing. So if you don't have that enzyme to do it, you cannot digest milk. So obviously, once young mammals are weaned, they don't need to make lactase anymore, do they? And if you think about it, a lot of enzymes they're expensive to make. So why make something that you don't need? So normally what happens is upstream of this gene that produces lactase is a promoter region that turns the production of lactase off at a certain age. Well, there's some individual adults, a lot of them, who can break down lactase. And what's happened is there was a mutation in that upstream gene that regulates lactase production that actually kept lactase on, making lactase all the time so you could break down milk. And those individuals left more offspring than individuals generally who didn't. Most of this happened in what are called pastoral or dairying cultures, where they had animals like goats and sheep and cattle that produced milk. And some individuals, probably very few, were able to digest the milk, and that gene spread, keeping the lactase gene on. Okay? So now there's some people who are lactose intolerant because, like most young animals, it was switched off. There are certain populations of people where this mutation in the upstream regulation of lactase that developed this mutation, or the mutation happened and it was then favorable. And actually, lactase or lactose, being able to digest lactose actually occurred about 3 different times in 3 different human populations. And we know it because the promoter region is what affected it. In other words, the regulation of the gene that made lactase. But that promoter region in each case had a different mutation. Now, proteins. We talked about proteins. So proteins get things done. Proteins are made of amino acids. They're amino acids that are strung together in what's called a polymer. That means many amino acids strung together. So here's our amino acid. It's got nitrogen, hydrogen. It's got an amine group, a carboxyl group, a side group, a whole bunch of different things that make up an amino acid. Okay. And these amino acids are held together by these peptide bonds. So you can make long strings of amino acids. And there's like 20 amino acids. Valine, alanine, phenylalanine, tryptophan. You don't have to memorize these things. And then these peptide bonds are strung together into a protein like this. And proteins have a specific shape, 3-dimensional shape. You can imagine if you had a mutation that substituted one amino acid for another, it might not make the protein work properly. So this is what a protein looks like. It's a polymer of amino acids strung together. Oh. Okay. So proteins are made of amino acids. And their amino acids are all strung together. Oftentimes there's thousands and thousands and thousands of amino acids that are strung together in a certain conformation. Okay. Proteins. We need proteins. We make proteins, but we also need the precursors to make proteins, which include all the amino acids. So proteins are a source of energy, but more importantly, they're the building blocks, namely the amino acids when they're broken down that can be then reconstituted to make the proteins that our body makes. Nuts and meat and fish and cheese, eggs, all are full of protein. My favorite, that's not a ribeye steak, but I personally like ribeye steak, a nice big fat ribeye. That's full of protein. I know that they say it's not good for you, but I don't believe them. Actually, things are changing in terms of what nutritionists once believed. But we'll get to that. So, proteins, that's one of the things that we need in terms of the cellular function that our cells do. So, as I said, proteins are made of amino acids. Most of them are coded in our genes to make specific proteins that we need, right? And they're all made from amino acids. And there's about 20 of them, or there are 20 of them. We do make many from scratch, but there are some amino acids that we can't. So we have to get it from other sources, namely our diet. amino acids, what are amino acids that we can't make on our own are called what? They're called essential amino acids. Okay, you don't have to memorize this chart. It turns out we can make 13 of the 20 amino acids from scratch. The other 7 are called essential amino acids we must get from our diet. So here you can see these are non-essential. We make these ourselves. These are essential. That means we don't make them for ourselves. We have to get it from our diet. And there's a few others that are conditionally essential. So sometimes we get it from our diet because we can't make enough of a certain kind of amino acid. Okay. So, anybody ever hear of tryptophan? Tryptophan. Okay. Tryptophan, why do people get sleepy when they eat turkey? Because supposedly turkey has a lot of tryptophan in it. Now, tryptophan is part of a pathway for neurotransmitters. These are hormones. Serotonin, melatonin, okay? And so some people propose a certain hypothesis. So here's the observation. I always get sleepy when I eat turkey. Tryptophan is a precursor for a sleep-inducing hormone, serotonin and melatonin. So that, why do I get sleepy when I eat turkey? Well, the hypothesis is that the tryptophan in turkey causes my sleepiness. This is the scientific method, right? Now, here's a prediction. If tryptophan does in fact cause sleepiness, then foods with higher levels of tryptophan should, and like turkey actually, should have a lot of tryptophan in it compared to other foods. Well, we can actually test this proposition without doing a real experiment. We just measure levels of tryptophan inside a protein, inside of various kinds of protein of food. So here we are. We've got eggs, 81 grams of protein, 1 gram of tryptophan, and 1.23% of total. You can see soybeans have so much raw protein, right? And it's got 0.59 grams, not very much. If we go down here to pork chop, we see that this is 19.27 grams of protein in the food, or 100 grams of food, and then tryptophan is 0.25 out of that total. Now, one of the large, and then we can look at protein percent. And we see that like soybeans actually do have a high percentage of tryptophan. Pumpkin seeds do. Sesame seeds. Oh, here's turkey. Okay, so turkey should have a lot. But compared to sesame seeds, it has about half as much percent per percent in terms of gram weight. So it actually, this refutes the hypothesis. In other words, we falsified it because we falsified the prediction that turkey should have a very high amount of tryptophan if in fact it causes sleepiness. Yeah.
Did they eat the same exact amount of grams of seeds with turkey?
Yes.
You wouldn't eat that much seeds.
No, it's exactly, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Per 100 grams, and then you get the percent of how much it is. Okay? So it's very controlled, same amount. Otherwise, just apples and oranges. So, it didn't, we falsified the prediction. So why do people, anybody in here get sleepy at Thanksgiving?
No, because I go to bed early.
What's that?
Because I go shopping afterwards.
You do, okay. You don't get sleepy. Anybody else? No one gets sleepy, huh? You don't want to just lie there and veg after you stuff yourself.
Yeah.
Like you just can't even move, right? Okay, I don't know. I usually take a nap after Thanksgiving, and then I wake up maybe an hour later and I go back to eating. So, now, we've all heard of vitamins. These are actually what are called coenzymes. Or they're cofactors for enzymes. They, for enzymes to work, they often need certain vitamins to actually carry out their catalytic function, chemical reaction function. So by definition, we can't synthesize on our own vitamins, except for, it turns out, vitamin D. By that we can, because vitamin D, if you go out in the sun, you can actually, our cells produce vitamin D. But everything else we have to get from our diet. In other words, vitamins are essentially, all of them are essential. Anybody ever heard of a disease called scurvy?
Yeah.
Okay, what is it?
I don't know exactly. I heard.
Okay. It turns out a lack of vitamin C, and you often see it, or you used to see it, on long ship voyages where they had no kinds of citrus or anything. They had no source of vitamin C. And what happens is your connective tissue starts to break down, you lose your teeth, you just kind of basically fall apart. In fact, it looks like, occasionally you see nowadays people with it because of their diet, and even in modern society, especially it turns out in a lot of autistic children, they like certain things, and for some, they're not getting enough vitamin C, and then they start having scurvy, and then they bring them to the doctor, and no one expects to see scurvy anymore, and they're surprised when they do. Okay, so that's why at one point British sailors were called limeys, because someone put together that citrus has a lot of vitamin C, and if the sailors got vitamin C, they didn't get scurvy. So they called them limeys because they grew tons of limes and handed them out. Now, there's all these minerals that I mentioned earlier. I said calcium, sodium, potassium. Let's see, K is potassium, what is it, manganese, I think. And we need certain minerals. We can't get them anywhere else but from our diet. And they also act as enzyme cofactors. Like if you've heard of hemoglobin, that's what makes our red blood cells red, because the mineral that's a cofactor is iron. Okay? And that's how it actually captures oxygen, which has a negative ionic charge. So it carries oxygen through the bloodstream. A lot of these things have to do with nerve transmission, gradients, and muscle contraction. Okay. So antioxidants actually neutralize free radicals, even though our cells use these ions, which are essentially free radicals all the time. Now, it's a big selling point. Like blueberries supposedly have lots and lots of antioxidants, and it's good for you.
Isn't that why they say that drinking a cup of red wine every single day will actually like improve your overall?
That's what they say, right? Has anybody ever done an experiment with this, do you think? It turns out no. This is all the food industry and nutrition science. They have made nutrition, you know, you get these regulations about what a healthy diet is. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, just put out, you know, like the food pyramid thing, a new one in 2015, about how much you should have of protein, of fats, unsaturated fats, all that kind of stuff. It turns out this thing called nutrition science, for the most part, isn't really science. No one has actually done the kinds of experiments that show that, let's say, taking vitamins is actually good for you. No one has actually shown that antioxidants is a hypothesis that that these free radicals, you know, they neutralize it. But no one has actually tested the hypothesis, let's say, that free radicals are bad. Okay? Free radicals, anything on ion with a charge is a free radical in a sense. And that's part of cellular function. So when you are told what to eat, what's good for you and what's not, a lot of it is just a bunch of baloney, which you can get protein from, by the way. Okay? And some essential amino acids. So I just want you to put on your skeptic's hat and say, what's the evidence? And nutrition science and food science and all that, it's not well supported. They make a lot of plausible arguments, hypotheses, like free radicals are really reactive, and maybe it's good that they don't react so much because they can cause cellular damage. But there's no real evidence of that whatsoever. What is this doing? Stop that. Okay. So, antioxidants neutralize free radicals. Okay, so minus charge, that's oxygen. We'll say potassium, which is K, is a plus. These are the ions that we're talking about, right? Okay. Now, these are highly reactive substances. They have to be. Like the iron, let's say, in hemoglobin, has to be very attractive to oxygen to bind it. So oxygen has a negative charge as a molecule. Potassium has a positive charge. They're both reactive. There are things called, what are called free radicals. Okay. And free radicals are elements that are highly reactive. Another one that's really highly reactive is chlorine. I forget what the thing is. Might be Cl. And it's very highly reactive. Okay. Now it's thought that these things are maybe bad. And that if you eat foods that can neutralize antioxidants, then it's a good thing. Oh, okay, good. Now, fats. Anybody in here like fat? I love fat. Oh, I do. I just love it. Just think about it. A steak without fat is like horrible. There's nothing there. It's just it's a dry. Anybody ever eat venison, deer, or elk, or caribou, or anything like that? That meat has very little fat in it, so you actually have to cook it very fast. Otherwise, it'll dry out into a piece of cardboard. But anyway, we like fats. Butter is a good example of a fat. Now, you've been told, this is part of the nutrition science business, again, you've been told that fats are bad, that you should restrict the amount of fat in your diet. Recently, there was a study that actually showed they fed people, let's say, butter or some other product with saturated fat in it. We'll learn what that is in a second. Because it's thought that that's what controls blood level cholesterol in the blood, how much there is. Okay? Like you eat a certain amount, it ends up in your blood. Cholesterol, a lot of it is bad. It causes plaques, it causes heart attacks, all that kind of stuff. Right? They found out that very little of what you eat in terms of fats ends up directly into your blood in terms of cholesterol. In fact, all the cholesterol in your blood is actually made in the liver. Now, there might be an indirect route where you eat tons of fat and, it's not necessarily all that good for you. But, and then nowadays they say, oh, unsaturated fats like olive oil or something are good and not as bad as, but there really was no evidence one way or the other. Now, I'm not going to tell you to go out and, like drink or eat lard or something like that. Don't do that. But take it with, like these things about, let's say, fat, that you want to think about it in terms of be a little skeptical. Now, it turns out fatty acids, are a very good source of energy. In fact, you can store a lot more energy in fats than you can in carbohydrates like glucose. Okay? So, it turns out plants store a lot of plants do, a lot of their energy stores are in carbohydrates. But we don't. It turns out that fats can store per gram a lot more energy than carbohydrates can. So you break those down, they're a good source of energy. Why do we use this? What do we use fatty acids for besides energy? Remember I was talking about what's the cell membrane made of? Anybody remember? Did you write it down? Starts with a P. pH. Phospholipid bilayer. Exactly. So, fats are important in terms of structure, cell structure, in terms of the membrane. Fats also often vary proteins around in the system, which is what cholesterol does. Okay, so here's our cell membranes, remember. We can synthesize most fatty acids from scratch. Those that we can are called essential, but if we look at this is what the cell membrane actually looks like. This is the phospholipid bilayer. This is the fatty tail. This is the part that is hydrophobic. It keeps the water out. And then this side is hydrophilic. It lets the water in. So that's how the membrane actually works. Now, there's this whole thing about saturated versus unsaturated fats. Now, fats are made of carbon and hydrogen, and then usually at the terminals they have an oxygen, water. This is actually water. No, it's not. It's H2O, right? No, it's not. 2 oxygens. Okay. And it forms these long chains, right? And a saturated fat is one that's straight. And it also means that at room temperature, it's solid, like butter. Margarine is an unsaturated fat, basically vegetable oil that's been turned into a saturated fat. Okay, and then if you actually look at an unsaturated fat, there's a kink. And there's this carbon double bond with 2 hydrogens attached. Okay, and that makes the fat unsaturated and liquid at room temperature. So saturated fats are bound to as much hydrogen as possible. All this kind of stuff I just do. Most plant fats are unsaturated. We can make saturated fat out of unsaturated by adding hydrogens to it. There's trans fats, which are unsaturated fats turned into solids. Supposedly, unsaturated fats are better for you, like olive oil and things like that. And saturated fats supposedly increase your risk of cardiovascular disease because they're part of cholesterol, and too much cholesterol causes these plaques to build up and then prevent blood flow and then cause heart attacks. Okay,